and I think we can get started. So good evening, everyone. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, which is the sponsor of tonight's program. And I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to what is our first event of the spring semester. This evening, we're hosting a conversation between Eric Alterman and Kai Bird on Eric Alterman's recently published book, We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel, that is out now for Basic Books. This investigation of the long relationship between the US and the State of Israel could not be more timely. It asks big, tough questions, not only about the political relations between the two countries, about the American role in the Middle East, but also about American Jewish identity and how its many facets have evolved over time. So we're especially excited to open our semester with what promises to be a lively and invigorating conversation. Many of you are familiar with the activities of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. If you are new to our events, perhaps you came to us through HNet, you'd like to learn more about what we have in store for the spring, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us so that we can keep you informed, and I will make sure to put our contact in the chat box in just a moment. I also have a discount code for Eric's book, which will go in the chat box as well. Now, as you can see, this talk is being recorded. It will be uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. So I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted during Eric's introduction and the conversation that is going to follow. And after the conversation, we will have some time to take questions from the public. We're going to use all of the tools that we have to take these questions. You can type out your questions in the chat box, and I will select some of them. You can use the Zoom hand raise function if you would like to speak, and I can call on you, or you can simply type out question in the chat box if you would like to speak. But I apologize in advance. This is a fairly large meeting, so I apologize if we cannot get to all the questions in the queue. Now, without further ado, let's introduce our speakers for this evening. Eric Alterman is Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, where he teaches courses in media and media history. He holds a PhD in history from Stanford University. From 1995 to 2020, he was the liberal media columnist at The Nation. He is now a contributing writer to that magazine, as well as to the American Prospect. He has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, The Guardian, The Daily Beast, and The Forward, among other publications. He is the author of What Liberal Media, The Truth About Bias in the News, that was published in 2003, and The Book on Bush, How George W. Misleads America, came out in 2004, both of them national bestsellers, as well as 9 other books. He has received the George Orwell Prize, the Stephen Crane Literary Award, and the Mirror Award for Media Criticism twice. He is also an elected member of the prestigious Society of American Historians. Kai Bird is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and journalist, as well as being the executive director and distinguished lecturer at the Graduate Center's Leon Levy Center for Biography. He is the author of 6 books, including most recently The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, that appeared in 2021. He's the acclaimed author of biographies of John J. McCloy, McGeorge Bundy, and William Bundy. His American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, co-authored with Martin Sherwin, won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2006, as well as the National Books Critics Circle Award, and the Duff Cooper Prize for History. His work includes critical writings on the Vietnam War, Hiroshima, nuclear weapons, the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the CIA. He too is an elected member of the Society of American Historians. So we are thrilled to welcome you both to the Center for Jewish Studies at the GC. Eric and Kai, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Francesca. I'm going to talk as briefly as I can because I'm tired of talking, and I prefer to have conversations. And Kai and I are going to talk. Kai and I have been talking since he edited my very first article ever in 1983 in The Nation. It was assigned by Victor Navasky, close friend to both Kai and mine of blessed memory. Kai, I want to mention also, was very helpful in the writing of this book. He read multiple drafts of chapters, and I didn't pay him anything. I want to thank him for doing this.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I'm sure there are a lot of Kai's fans out there that are here stuck with me, and I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. Yeah, so I don't want to make any of the arguments of the book. I just want to say a little bit about why I wrote it, and then describe its structure, and then have a conversation with Kai and everybody who's here. So why did I write this book? Two reasons, two good reasons and a couple of personal reasons. The good reasons are this. First of all, I guess there's three good reasons. One is there's no book like it. There's no book on the history of the debate over Israel in the United States. I have, I could make a very sizable donation to a library of the books I have on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm sure they're in three figures, just of my own. But there's no book like this. And I think it's very important. I think it has a lot of implications. The second reason I wrote this book is because everything having to do with Israel and Palestine is complicated. And everything having to do with debating Israel and Palestine is even more complicated than that, because you have to get past the myths and the anger on both sides in order to try and get at the truth, and then to show how the truth is twisted and perverted in the discourse. So that takes a lot of time and space, and you can't do it in a short article or in a column. I've written, I don't know, probably hundreds of columns about Jews, American Jews, and US foreign policy relating to the Middle East. But I felt like I never could do justice to the complexity in any of them until I wrote this book, which, by the way, is over 500 pages. The third reason, and that's a tribute to the complication of the issue. The third reason is that I tried to make a rule for myself. I don't know if I kept it 100%, but I did a pretty good job on it a while back, that I would never discuss the Arab-Israeli conflict with anyone. And that the reason for that is unless you hold exactly the same assumptions about the conflict, which almost no one does, even people you basically agree with don't. It's impossible to change anyone's mind about anything having to do with Israel and Palestine. And the reason for this is that Israel and Palestine is not an issue, it's an identity for the people who care deeply about it. And on the one hand, you get usually if you make a good point that a person has to concede, then you get a whataboutist response. What about this? What about that? What about, And the second reason is that the second thing that happens is that and the person, well, actually, they just get angry. And people just get pissed off at each other rather than change their minds, because again, they feel personally attacked. This has always been true, not always, but it's been true for 75 years about many American Jews, and it's increasingly become true about Israel's opponents. So again, I felt like I wanted to lay out everything clearly in a book, and that would be my statement, and I wouldn't have to argue with people anymore, or I wouldn't have to avoid arguing with people. So those are the reasons why I think the book is useful. The personal reasons I have is that the issue has really lived inside of me for a long time. I'm such a nerd that when I wrote my honors thesis in college 41 years ago, I wrote about this issue and I saved my notes. I still have the little index cards from the interviews and the research I did, and some of them made it into the book. 10 years later, I was in graduate school working on my dissertation, and I thought I was going to do a dissertation that was, again, related to this topic. I spent a year on it. I decided not to do that dissertation because the problem with Jews, I don't know if it's just true of Americans, the problem with Jews is that they write too much. When you write a dissertation, what you're really doing is proving that you've read absolutely everything related to your topic. And I decided I would never be able to do that with this topic because of Jews. So I put it aside and wrote another book called When Presidents Lie. Everybody should read that book too. Again, I saved those notes as well.
No, it's not a matter of well,
dude, off with the mute yourself. Okay. So it's been an issue that's been sticking in my craw, so to speak, for 40 years. I've written hundreds of columns about it and articles. and I felt like I was the person to write this book, in part because, like I said, I have a PhD in history of American foreign policy. I've written more, for 40 years, for 25 years, I was the nation's media columnist, and I wrote a lot of media articles for other people. I just spent 2 years with the American Prospect writing about the media, and I think I understand it pretty well. And the media is where most of these debates take place, not exclusively, but most of them. So I think the combination of my training as a historian and as a media expert, so to speak, made it possible for me to write a book that nobody else could have written. I did get help. I went to some people who I felt knew a lot more about certain aspects, particularly of the conflict itself, than I did, and Jewish history than I did. But I'm very pleased with this book. I've said this before, but I keep saying it. I've never written anything in my life, I'm 63 years old, that I didn't want to take anything back from, that I felt proud of without any caveat. So even if the book gets nothing but lousy reviews and everybody hates it, I'm glad that I wrote it. Now, I just want to take a couple minutes talking about the structure of the book. It's a history. And it's a history that I try and stay out of. There are a few places where I could have quoted my Bubby and Zeta profitably, but I didn't, where I could have put myself in the book, or where I was attacked by certain people for telling the truth. I left those out. I tried to write it strictly as a historian, maybe until the very end. The things that I think people will find surprising about that history, one thing that's surprising is that until the 1920s, most American Jews were very strongly anti-Zionist. The name of the first chapter is Zionism for Thee and Not for Me. I had that quote in the book, but actually it was Kai Bird who told me, you should really call the first chapter, which I did. It wasn't until 1920 or so, a little later, that Justice Louis Brandeis became head of the Zionist Organization of America. And he dealt with the problem for American Jews and Zionism was that German Jews who had come over here long before the Eastern European Jews came and overwhelmed the numbers of the German Jews, their biggest concern was always being seen as patriotic Americans. And they were worried about inspiring the kind of anti-Semitism that had followed Jews everywhere else they had ever lived. They thought they were thrilled, they would love their new country and the way they were treated, and they didn't want to do anything to upset it, which is why for a long time they tried to keep the Eastern European Jews out. And they were afraid that if they supported Jews as a people who were going to live in another country, that this would call into question their loyalty to the United States. And Louis Brandeis was convinced to become head of the Zionist Organization of America. He was perhaps the most famous and respected Jew in America. He was a German Jew who defended the Eastern Europeans in their labor struggles, so they loved him. And he said, look, American Jews are cool. We don't need Zionism, but a lot of Jews in the world do. So we're not going anywhere, but we need to help people who need a refuge. And that sort of turned the trick for American Jews and said, okay, we can do that. And Zionism lost a lot of the anger that had been directed toward by Reform Jews. And over time, became more and more popular. During at the end of World War II, when the struggle to create what became the nation of Israel was going on, American Jews were torn because as they learned more and more about the Holocaust, they felt worse and worse about their inability to do anything to address the horrific situation in Europe. But in Israel or in Palestine, they found they could do something. And not only that, they were terribly shamed by what was happening in the Holocaust and their own impotence in addressing it, and thrilled to have the opportunity to support this new venture, which would be the first Jewish Commonwealth in 2,000 years. It wasn't clear it was going to be a state for a while. And this new Jew, this beautiful, handsome, beautiful, strong, militaristic, poetry writing, intellectual, lovemaking Jew. And this redefined American Jewish identity over time. The second thing that I think people find surprising is that after the founding of the State of Israel, which again, American Jews were thrilled to support and supported in what I think is the largest lobbying campaign in all of human history, they sort of stepped back from Israel and kind of forgot about it. They marched in parades on occasion, and I collected money for Jewish National Fund to plant trees in Israel instead of UNICEF on Halloween. But it wasn't until 1967 that American Jews became invested in Israel to the degree that we recognize today, that they have been until quite recently, I would say. If you look at the report of the American Jewish Committee, the annual report in 1966, it doesn't mention Israel until page 36. If you look at Nathan Glazer's History of American Judaism, sociology actually, published in 1957, it doesn't mention Israel at all. And yet, after 1967, American Jewish organizations and American Jewish individual identity became wrapped up almost exclusively in Israel. It turned overnight. It's really amazing. The transformation, no one could have predicted it, and its longevity has been very impressive. Now, this has gone through a lot of phases, obviously, in the past 60 years. And Kai and I are going to talk about that, and we'll all talk about it. But I guess what I want to say is that the Israel that American Jews attached themselves to was really a fantasy land. It was a Disney version of Israel, what I call in the book an Exodus version of Israel. I spent a lot of time on the book and the movie Exodus and its influence on the vision of Israel that was created. And at the same time, the American Jewish organizations were committed to that mythical version of Israel and were willing to fight that no one should be allowed to deviate from it, at least in public. In private, people could, but not in public. So there's always been this fight over the perception of Israel in the media and in amongst political organizations. And the funny thing about it is that the people who dissented from it were always demonized and attacked and called all kinds of names. And yet a few years later, the people who were doing the demonizing would be adopting the same view that they had been demonizing earlier as the boundaries of debate shifted. We'll talk about that. So that, at one point to say the word Palestinian, Jimmy Carter, Kai can talk about Jimmy Carter, and to say the word Palestinian homeland was considered anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And then to different terms over the years have to say the Palestinians deserve their own state was out of bounds. And lately there's been an enormous fight over the word apartheid, which I cover at the very end of the book. And so the shifting debate over Israel has had enormous implications, both for American Jewish identity, but also for American democracy, because the various Israeli lobbies, the most famous of them being AIPAC, the most powerful, are some of them probably certainly the most powerful foreign policy lobby in the history of the United States, including the China lobby, I would say. It's kind of like the National Riflery Association, in that Americans are much more sympathetic to Israel than are any other democracy. But they're not as sympathetic enough to explain US foreign policy towards Israel, which is far more extreme than Americans know or support according to surveys. Just like in the NRA, Americans like guns a lot more than other people in any other country, way more. And yet 92% of Americans support stronger gun control laws than we have, and they don't get them. And that's a function of some of the failures of our democratic system, which you can see in many areas, but this is another one. So I try to explain without, I go into great depth on some of these issues because I worry that a simplistic answer, a kind of Twitter answer, sounds anti-Semitic. It plays into anti-Semitic stereotypes. And the reality is much more complicated than that. And again, I think it requires a book. Now, our discourse in the United States doesn't really embrace books very much. It embraces easy slogans and Twitter tweets. So I'm therefore enormously appreciative of the opportunity to talk about it at some length in this community and with Kai. And I have a lot more to say, but the last thing I want to say is please read the book, because I put a lot of work into it, and I think it's really good. And I can't really do justice to much of it in a short time. So let's talk about some of it, and thanks for having me. Kai, how's it going?
Okay, Eric, thank you for that summary and your comments. Listen, I think this is a really important book. It's a sweeping intellectual history that is extremely timely. I mean, just look at the headlines in the newspapers every day about Israel, Palestine, and our worries about the democratic character of Netanyahu's Israel this week, the fight over the court issues. Anyway, it's very timely, and you remind us in this history that this is that this debate between the diaspora and Israel goes back decades, and it's a fascinating debate filled with colorful personalities, and the book is really readable. It's lively, well documented and footnoted, and plenty of quotations from all the debates that you refer to as being arduous and sometimes heated. So let's begin by talking about the title. So here we are. We are not one, a history of America's fight over Israel. Why this title, and why is it so provocative?
Well, thanks, Kai. The title has, for me, 3 implications. The first one, which ought to be obvious, is that America and Israel are not the same country. America and Israel are not one. Again, it ought to be obvious on the one hand. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of people in this book who are prominent people, editors and journalists and intellectuals, who argue that Israel and the United States have identical interests. And whenever Israel does anything, the United States has no right to object because Israel is acting on behalf of the United States and its values. So I needed to say that America, a superpower that reaches 2 oceans on either side and is not really physically threatened by anyone. And Israel, which is this tiny little country surrounded by all these Arab countries, who feels itself constantly under siege, and has a population of 20%, rarely discussed, over 20% Arabs, is a very different place than the United States. The second we are not one. The second we is American Jews and Israeli Jews. Israel is the only only putatively democratic country in the world that likes Trump better than it likes Biden or Obama. Every other democratic country in the world vastly prefers Obama to Biden. Even if the politics were not divergent, and they are extremely divergent and getting even more so. The experience of living in Israel is nothing like the experience of being an American Jew. And the vicarious nature of the American Jewish identity with Israel, I think, is unhealthy and unsustainable. So American Jews and Israeli Jews are not one. And thirdly, and this is largely because of the increasing the increasing anger and acrimony over Israel itself, American Jews are themselves not one. Roughly 70% of American Jews are liberals and vote for Democrats. 25 to 30% are conservatives. the conservatives have a much stronger voice relative to their numbers than the liberals do. That's because they care more, they're more dedicated, and also they seem to have more resources. So that when AIPAC, for instance, endorsed 109 Republican insurrectionists with its PAC in the last midterm election, they were treated as if they were speaking for American Jews, but of course they weren't. Their views were much closer to Christian Zionists than they were to American Jews. J Street, which is a much smaller organization than AIPAC and far worse funded, actually speaks in terms of public opinion polls for a majority of American Jews. But again, the liberals who support J Street and other liberal organizations, they care about a lot of things. They care about abortion, they care about inequality, they care about race relations. Whereas the Jews who support the Israeli government and on the right, they care about Israel almost exclusively. Again, that's similar to the NRA. And so they are much more powerful. Those small numbers are much more powerful than the large numbers who take the other view. In any case, most rabbis will tell you that they don't want to talk about Israel anymore in their synagogues because it's just too divisive in their communities. And that's the third reason that I call it We Are Not One.
So you mentioned J Street just now. I noticed in the book that you spend several pages talking about the existence of something called Bray Ra in the 1970s. And Bray Ra seems to have been sort of a predecessor of J Street, the J Street of the 1970s. But I think it's a fascinating story, who started it. In fact, one of the chairman of Bray Ra, I think you mentioned, is Rabbi Arnold Wolf, who was the rabbi close to Barack Obama as a young man in Chicago. Anyway, it's a great story, and I'd like to hear you talk about it. What happened to Bray Ra?
Well, I feel like you just told it, Guy.
No.
But I'll fill in some of the blanks. Yeah, Bray Ra was started by a group of rabbis and clergy and non-clergy Israel, but very dedicated Jews, who in the early 1970s said, we don't like the direction Israel's taking. We care about the Palestinians. And as Jews who love Israel and care about Israel, we want to help it live up to its ideals. This was the first time that American Jews had gone public with their criticism of Israel. There had been criticism spoken in private in the past. And originally, people were like, well, let's see where this goes. Well, maybe this can be all right if American Jews can be a sort of counterpoint to the Israeli government. But first of all, American Jews were very uncomfortable. Many American Jews were very uncomfortable with any criticism of Israel. The view was, and the view certainly taken by Israelis, that if you want to disagree with us, come over and live here and face the threats that we face, or shut up and sign the checks. But secondly, Henry Kissinger, under Nixon's Secretary of State at the time, made a promise to the Israelis that he would never speak to the PLO, and this is going to lead to Kai's next question. I can tell. Unless the PLO recognized Israel. And a couple of the rabbis had a meeting with somebody who was close to the PLO. And this was felt to be crossing a line and getting involved and undercutting Israel and getting involved in diplomacy where they had no business. And it gave Bray Ra's opponents, there was a right-wing journalist named Raul Jean Isaac, there was another commentary magazine got involved, and a number of rabbis, including, by the way, the father, the president of the American Jewish Congress, whose name was Lelyveld, whose son became the executive editor of the New York Times, Joseph Lelyveld. And Bray Ra was crushed by its mistake in meeting with the PLO. It was followed, by the way, by another group called the New Jewish Agenda, which was a kind of successor group to Bray Ra, and that group was in the late 70s and early 80s. So it was a tiny group. It got, again, some positive press, mostly in the left-wing press. But I think I say in the group that in the book that they had a demonstration one night against the AJC or the UJA, I forget which, one of the Jewish organizations. And the amount of money that was raised at that dinner was something like 10 times the amount of the annual budget that New Jewish Agenda ever raised. So the thing about J Street is that it was the first Jewish organization that was willing to disagree with the Israeli government in public and was taken seriously in the political world. So they were formed at the beginning of the Obama administration in support of the Obama administration's attempt to force Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. And the Obama administration appreciated that, and so invited them to, briefings and so forth, and treated them as if they were legit. The other Jewish organization, however, did not, and they still are not a member of the major umbrella group because they were rejected in a couple of votes, even though there's no question that they represent the views of the vast majority of American Jews compared to the groups that are in there. So it's not a democratic world that that organized Jewry operates under.
So wait a minute, stop there. That's an extraordinary statement that J Street represents the majority, and yet the established Jewish organizations, AIPAC, the American Jewish Congress,
the American Jewish Congress doesn't really, American Jewish Committee, the ADL, and AIPAC are the three biggest organizations.
Then and they have far more influence on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, well, this is a big issue. I don't get to it towards the end of the book, but I'll give you an example of what I mean. So, I wrote a book on democracy and foreign policy, which nobody read. But American foreign policy is not remotely democratically formed. It's formed by powerful lobbies and interest groups. And AIPAC is among perhaps the most powerful lobby and interest group when it comes to US foreign policy. They not only help elect congressmen and senators, they hire staff for them. They make sure the wrong people are not hired. They get involved in arguments over who will fill what position in the Pentagon and the State Department, and they have enormous influence. And even if you have no concern about Israel particularly, you don't want to get on their wrong side. Just this week, actually, the United States did not hire someone, I don't know his name off the top of my head, for a position with regard to Latin American human rights enforcement because he had been too critical of Israel, as if the two had any relationship whatsoever. So, again, American Jews are roughly divided. There's a slight advantage to the J Street side over AIPAC. Something like 60% of American Jews would like to see the United States be tougher on Israel with regard to settlement, say, and many are sympathetic to using aid as a lever, something Joe Biden has said he will never do. In the Democratic Party today, the party itself is split half and half between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel in terms of who they favor. But in terms of young people, it's moving much more in the direction of the Palestinians. But again, it's about half and half. Okay, so consider it half and half. Now, the United States under Obama signed a memo of understanding with Israel in which it promised to give Israel $38 billion worth of aid over the next 10 years. Something, again, that I don't think has any precedent in diplomatic history. One country promising another country to give it X amount of money, quite a lot of money, over a period of 10 years. That's the law. But when Israel had its war in 2021 with Hamas over Gaza, it used up what it said was about $1 billion worth of Iron Dome missiles. These are missiles that shoot down other missiles that were developed jointly by the United States and Israel for this purpose. So a bunch of congressmen said, well, let's give Israel an extra $1 billion on top of the $38 billion to make up for what they spent in this war. as if the purpose of the 38 billion wasn't for this in the first place. In any case, what was the vote in Congress? It was, there's 538 congressmen. The vote was 429 to 8 with one abstention. The abstention was AOC. So a lot of people say, well, look, the Democratic Party is not supportive of Israel, and the Squad is anti-Israel, and Ilhan Omar is dangerous, etc. But when push comes to shove, the vote was 429 to 8. And that's because of the power of the, well, first of all, it's in part because the Republican Party is entirely in the pocket of its base, which is Christian Zionists and also extremely conservative, wealthy Jewish donors like Sheldon Adelson, the largest single donor to the late Sheldon Adelson, the largest single donor to the Republican Party of all time. But it's also because of the structure of US foreign policy in which AIPAC and American Jewish Committee and other organizations have a kind of stranglehold on the discourse. And even though American Jews don't agree with these views, that doesn't matter. They don't have any structural power. Structural power is on the side of these legacy pro-Israel organizations, which today have a view much closer to Christian Zionists than they do to American Jews, who remain the most liberal non-people of color in America.
So, Eric, that brings me to ask you a question about the media. You know, you write a little bit about the New Republic, actually quite a bit, and the influence of Marty Peretz, and also Peter Beinart, who comes out of the New Republic. And he has one sort of political journey that is somehow emblematic of this debate. And you also write a lot about the New York Times and its coverage and what it agrees to cover and how it chooses not to cover some aspects of the argument. And you write a lot about Tom Friedman. So my question is, how do you compare the political odyssey between Peter Beinart and Tom Friedman? They've both evolved on this issue, but in slightly different directions, I'd guess.
No, I sent Tom the book. He thanked me for it and hasn't replied since. I'm having Peter invited me to join him for a conversation, which we'll be having on March 4th on his weekly Friday conversations. So look, Tom Friedman went to Brandeis. He was, as he said himself, a committed 3 times a year synagogue Jew, which is actually what most American Jews are. American Jews are if you leave the Orthodox out, they go to synagogue very rarely compared to Christians. They're very unreligious, largely speaking. And he was the correspondent in Israel during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and during the siege of Beirut and the massacre in a refugee camp by the Lebanese of the Palestinians in a place called Sabra and Shatila. But the massacre was enabled by Israeli soldiers that sealed off the place so that their allies, the Christian, the Lebanese Christians, the Phalangist Party, could do their dirty work uninhibited. So Friedman saw this and it shocked him and it horrified him. And he wrote one of the longest articles I've ever seen in the New York Times in my life on Sabra and Shatila. But interestingly, he couldn't convince this Brandeis Jewish correspondent, proud Jewish correspondent, couldn't convince his New York Times editors that he was actually seeing what he was seeing. So when he said that the Israelis were indiscriminately bombing Beirut, the New York Times editors in New York took out the word indiscriminate. And he fought with them. He said, I'm here, I'm watching it. And they said, tough luck. And there are a number of examples in the book where the New York Times just can't bear to report what, it doesn't dispute the truth of it, it just can't bear to report it. And that's a complicated issue. You could say it's because they have so much of the Jewish readership. You could say that they're worried about the pressure from the ADL and all the media organizations that are ready to attack them, what I've written about many times called working the refs. Or you could say that they just can't bring themselves to believe it. But this happens over and over. It happened to same thing happened to Washington Post. There was a story, I don't think I put it in the book, but there was a story that was told to me by the Washington Post foreign editors, where they invited members of Jewish organizations to watch them. This was also during Lebanon, to watch them edit their news, edit their correspondence who were reporting back from Lebanon. And the correspondents would report something about what Israeli troops were doing. And the people, the guys watching them over their shoulder were saying, that's impossible. That can't be happening. I know Israelis would never do such a thing. And they're like, our reporters are reporting it, and I don't even know if it got reported, but that kind of thing happens a lot. And the value of the Israeli, the organizations that support Israel and try to monitor the debate is much more in what is not reported. Not necessarily censoring Tom Friedman or David Shipler, who was also censored inside the New York Times. But it's in not wanting the hassle. It's in not wanting the bother. It's in not wanting to have the fight. I quote an Israeli diplomat saying, "This is how we win. We get them to self-censor." And for the longest time, there was only one side to this debate. You only had to worry about the Israel side. Today, you have to worry about both sides. Today, you will be attacked by the Palestinians and by the Israelis, no matter what you write. But I still think that the attacks from the pro-Israel side matter a lot more. It'll be very interesting to see now that Israel has this government, which very few people are willing to support, except for the far right, if that situation remains the same. But until recently, there's no question. I quote the New York Times executive editor, Dean Baquet, saying, "I promise you the attacks from either side are just as nasty as, if you only experience one."
Right.
And I can personally attest to that since I get attacked.
Yeah, but Eric, that quote is hardly believable when you look at the ineffectiveness of the Palestinian spokespersons. Their intellectuals just.
Kai, you and I both know that this is true about everything on the left. I mean, the left is just as nasty on the right. It just isn't as powerful.
It's right.
A friend of mine once said, I was in a fight with a very far leftist having to do with the nation. I don't want to relive it right now. and a friend of mine said, Eric, the problem you have is that you're being attacked on Twitter. If you were taking the other side, you could lose your job. Like one side can cost you your job and one side can just make you annoyed on Twitter. So I promise you that I actually think the Palestinian side is nastier than the pro-Israel side. But they're powerless. And as someone once said, absolute powerlessness corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, they're very ineffective. Yeah. So that leads me to ask you to explain your critique or problem with BDS.
Yeah, well, the one reason that no one, maybe you, Kai, but probably even not even you, almost no one, not even my mother, who's really not up to the job anymore, will agree with everything in this book. Because I spent a lot of time in the book being critical of Israel and the quote unquote pro-Israel lobby, but I'm also quite critical of Palestinians. I have a great deal of sympathy for the problems the Palestinians face. One problem they face is that they don't see the future very well. So in the 1920s and 1930s, they were offered deals that would have kept them in the majority forever, and they just didn't take them. 1947, they refused even to meet with the UN. 1979 was it, Kai, Camp David? Edward Said, who I was friendly with, told me that Jimmy Carter had sent him, Cyrus Vance had sent him to Beirut to get Arafat to join in the Camp David Accord, and Arafat refused even to meet him.
Right.
So, and the Palestinians, in retrospect, clearly should have taken the deal, as bad as it may have been, offered to them by Ehud Barak and President Clinton in 2000. They'd have a stake, they could work from that, but they always hold out for some impossible dream and they end up with nothing. Now, I have sympathy for this position, for their problem, because I think they have a bunch of constituencies that are impossible, literally impossible to satisfy simultaneously. I don't say this in the book, but I once spent a few hours inside a Palestinian refugee camp. It was the worst place I've ever been in my life. My life was threatened in it, physically for a minute. But leaving that aside, the kids there were they were unhealthy. They were open sewage. There was snot coming out of their nose. Their clothes had holes in them. They weren't going to school. They had no hope. I did that in 1988. So I was there with the grandchildren of the people who had been expelled in 1940. Their grandchildren are now in those camps, okay? And their grandchildren will be in those camps as far as we can tell. Then you have the Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. Actually quite different situations. Then you have the Palestinian Israelis living inside Israel. Then you have the Palestinian diaspora, some of whom work in Arab countries and doing manual labor, some of whom live quite nicely in the rest of the world and have made lives for themselves in exile. And then you have the whole Arab world. So when Arafat was mulling over the deal that Barack and Clinton offered him, the Egyptians and the Saudis said, no deal. You're not getting all of Jerusalem, no deal. They're not even Palestinians. So how can you satisfy all of these different constituents? You can't, you can only say no.
Right.
And that's how the Palestinians held together. Now, with regard to BDS, I'm one of the more vocal opponents of BDS on the left. And again, I don't make myself part of the story, but I do explain the arguments that have led me to this position because I think they're part of history. BDS has no theory of effectiveness. It has no theory for how it's going to achieve what it says it wants to achieve. If you talk to someone about how is BDS going to work, inevitably, without exception, the discussion turns to South Africa. Israel is not South Africa. If you want to call what Israel does apartheid, in some instances I wouldn't argue with you, in some I would, depending on what part you're talking about. But it's nothing like South Africa. It's apartheid in another sense of the word, which is the international, the ICC definition. But the argument that the BDS supporters make is that the United States and the international community will force Israel, the Israeli Jews, to give up their country and turn it over to the Palestinians so that there can be a free Palestine from the river to the sea. They don't say that we want two states. They say we want one. They don't actually take a position, but they talk about the right of return for those people expelled in 1948 and full democratic rights for all Arabs in Israel. The Israelis are never going to do that. The United States is never going to pressure Israel to do that. And they've had absolutely no success so far. So the movement was started in 2004, 2005. So far, they have succeeded in convincing 0 national governments, 0 local governments, 0 universities, 0 labor unions, and 0 corporations to join their cause. The most recent survey of Americans on this issue found that 4% of Americans supported BDS, 2% supported it strongly. That's after 19 years of agitation. They do have the support of magazines and leftist organizations and some academic organizations. And this is where it lives. Now, BDS has some value in that it lets the Palestinians know they haven't been completely forgotten. And when they felt completely forgotten in the 1970s, the result was terrorism, which is destructive and helpful to them.
Right.
But it's not going to increase the likelihood. It's not going to help those people in those refugee camps or the people under occupation. What it is instead is compromises free speech and free discourse in universities, which to me is enough of a reason to oppose it. But it also has given right-wingers and the Israeli lobby and Israel itself an excuse to shut down dissent. And that's all it's really accomplished. So it seems to me to be kind of a fashion statement more than a strategy. The next question I'm often asked is, well, what would you do instead? And the problem is, and the horror is, I don't have an answer for that. I don't know what one should do instead. But, you know, I've just been asked to write an article for a journal called the Journal of Palestine Israel, I think it's called. And it's edited by Palestinians. And they asked me to compare the argument for the Zionists in the 1940s with the argument for the Palestinian state today. And there are a lot of differences. But one big difference is that the Zionists argued openly with each other. They fought, and they had the ability to unite on what they agreed on. And the Palestinians, they don't argue openly. They feel themselves to be under siege, and they feel their cause to be so difficult that they lack any form of democratic discourse. And so they're not open to self-criticism or changing their views. And to me, it's a very unhealthy situation. So Edward Said, again, he had a lot of criticism from the Palestinian leadership, and he voiced it in real time. And he was, you know, he suffered for it in some ways. In other ways, he was admired for it. But today, there's nobody like that. There's nobody who says, are we really on the right path? Is what we're doing leading to our goal? And the people who do say that, like I might be one of them, are considered to be, you know, unkosher, to use that word in a funny way, to be unsympathetic, to be not taken seriously. And I don't blame them, because I won't pretend that the Palestinians are my primary cause in life. I'm much more concerned with what Israel has done to itself as a putatively democratic country, and
right. So let's come back to the book. We're running out of time, but I want to sort of close and then open up to, at least for a few minutes, to some other questions from the audience. So this book, you know, I think it's hard not to argue that it's deeply researched and well footnoted and documented, and it's a timely history, intellectual history of a very important argument that we read in the papers every day. So the book has been out for what, 3 months, a little more?
November 22nd.
So what kind of reception has it received in whatever circles?
Well, thank you for asking that. I don't want to sound like I'm whining. It's been well received in much of the Jewish community, including organizations like the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Center for Jewish History, and I'm very happy to be here tonight, and other academically oriented Jewish Americans for Peace Now. I was invited to speak at J Street. But it has been, by and large, with the exception of the wonderful, short, but nevertheless wonderful rave in the New Yorker magazine, which added it to its best book list of the best books of 2022, it's been largely ignored in the mainstream media. I've been quoted, but the book hasn't been reviewed really anywhere except The Guardian.
So what, they're afraid to touch it?
Well, you know, I'd be attributing thoughts to them that I couldn't know. It's certainly possible that the New York Times is uncomfortable, and other organizations, but particularly the New York Times, is uncomfortable with all the criticism it receives in the book, and it just doesn't want to deal with it, doesn't want to seem defensive, or can't deal with it, and therefore doesn't want to. It's possible that some organizations don't like the fact that I've been writing media criticism for 25 years at The Nation and 2 more years at American Prospect, and don't want to be nice to Eric Alterman because he's such a meanie to them. Or it's possible that the book's pub date came out when all the publications were doing their best of years and wrapping up, and then in 2023, they were like, okay, what's new for 2023? I don't know. It's been an enormous disappointment to me because I felt like the controversy that this book ought to inspire, since, as I said, I don't expect anyone to agree with all of it, was going to be a way for people to hear about it. And I think a lot of people won't hear about it because they're not part of this community that is paying attention to it. So thank you for asking me that. It's a source of great pain to my heart, but I'm grateful to anyone who gives me the opportunity to talk about it.
So, Francesca, do you want to open it up to some questions?
Let's open it up to some questions from the public. I already see two questions from Jordan Wellman in the chat. So let me just combine them both. Is there any data as to what percentage of non-Jews in the US believe, as Trump does, that Jews owe or should owe their primary allegiance to Israel and not the United States? And a follow-up question, too new for the book, but how worried should we be about democracy in Israel, the new government and their plans for the judiciary, etc.? We even see predictions of potential civil war.
Well, the question as to whether or not Jews should owe their primary allegiance to Israel, that's an anti-Semitic assumption. Trump is an anti-Semite. And the idea that American Jews' first allegiance should not be to America is what the Reformed Jews were so worried about, that people would assume that because they were supportive of Israel, they could not also be loyal American Jews. And Trump is saying that your first loyalty is to Israel rather than to the country in which you live and pay taxes to and conceivably could fight for. So I would say, you can't poll that kind of thing, because if you answer the way Trump puts it, then you're giving the anti-Semites their weapon. Now, it is true of some Jews. I would say it's true of some Jewish intellectuals, and I name them in the book, who I wouldn't say that they think that their first loyalty is Israel. It's that they can't imagine their American identity being in any way separate from their Jewish identity, and their Jewish identity is expressed exclusively through support of Israel. I say this is true of Marty Peretz. I say it's true of Norman Podhoretz, and I say it's true of a number of people. But they would say that they're loyal Americans. It's just that Americans don't realize that Israel is really an extension of America. Ironically, the left and the right agree on this, that Israel is just America, a small America out there fighting America's battles in the world against the infidels. So you could say it's Trump and Edward Said have a similar view on this. As to the current situation, I like to say I'm a historian, and therefore I don't want to predict the future. But there's one of the Arab members of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, recently said, Israel is a democratic country if you're Jewish, and a Jewish country if you're an Arab. So to the degree that the Israelis feel themselves threatened by Arabs, quote unquote Arabs, they're going to be less and less democratic. And it's actually quite a small minority of Israelis that are pushing these anti-democratic laws forward. The majority of Israelis do not support them, but the Israeli political structure has given them the power in the system to do this. And because Bibi Netanyahu is so terrified of going to jail over his corruption charges, he feels he has no choice to let them have all the power they demand. So this minority is kind of similar to the MAGA movement. The MAGA movement's about 30% of the country. This group in Israel is an even smaller group, but their ability to manipulate the Israeli political system has given them the power, it looks like, to push through these laws that definitely threaten the future of Israeli democracy. I don't know what will happen in the future. The Israeli quote unquote resistance is much bigger and relatively speaking, and more energetic than the American resistance to Trump ever was. And I think it'll be hard for it to be rolled over. I think there's a real danger of civil war if it is. And I think Netanyahu, although he shares a lot in common with Trump, he's a lot smarter and cannier and more married to reality. And I think he will find a way to weave a path that keeps him indispensable in preventing both civil war and the complete destruction of Israeli democracy, whereas there will be considerable damage to it, maybe irreparable damage.
As we're waiting for more people to, again, you can either type your question in the chat box or feel free to use the Zoom hand raise function. I have a question for you going back to young American Jews today. And in particular, one question that I asked before when you were emphasizing the distance between some of the institutional representation of the American Jewish Council, APAC, and how what seems to be a majority of American Jewry feels about Israel and America's relationship with Israel. So how do you see a way forward? You just said you're a historian, you don't want to speculate about the future, but you're also a journalist, and I'm sure that you have opinions, and you do raise some of those questions in the last chapter of your book.
Yeah, thank you. In the last chapter of the book, I kind of step out of my historian's role, and I say that I have a concern here, which is the future of American Jewry. That for the past at least 50 years and maybe longer, the focus of collective American Jewish identity, and in many cases individual American Jewish identity, has been exclusively tied to Israel and the sacralization of the Holocaust, which is also tied to Israel. And that's how I was raised, and it kind of worked for me. I'm a Jew. My daughter is a Jew. I hope her children will be Jewish, and I think they will be. But it isn't working for most American young Jews today. That identity, which was based on a mythical Israel and a closeness to the horrors of the Holocaust and its uniqueness at the time, no longer is attracting young people to Judaism. So that conservative Judaism has lost a third of its members in the past few years, past decade. And Reform Jews has lost about 20%, but that number would be a lot higher if it weren't for conservative Jews becoming Reform Jews. So I think that even if you love everything about Israel and support everything it's ever done, you still need to be concerned about what is the future of a very different sort of Judaism, which is diaspora Judaism, where roughly half of American Jews live, which is in the United States. And I think that the laziness of just defining Judaism as support for Israel and birthright system of getting American Jews to try and stay Jewish by sending them to Israel. That just a small piece of it could go towards investing in what might make sense to make young people find Judaism meaningful to them in a way that it doesn't seem to be anymore. So that's the place in the book where I step out of my role as a historian and I say I have this concern, and even that is considered by many in the organized Jewish community to be a sort of heresy.
There's a great segue. There's a question from Paula Marquez, who's asking, what do you see as positive actions American Jews can take now?
Well, again, one thing we haven't talked about, and that doesn't get talked about much, is that the Israelis don't really care what American Jews think. They don't feel, particularly lately when they've become so conservative, they're much more comfortable talking to conservative Christians who agree with them than American Jews who give them a lot of hassles. Way back when, this is a long time ago, under Nixon, a bunch of liberal American rabbis met with Golda Meir and they said, "Why are you supporting Nixon? We hate Nixon." And she said, "Where are your phantom jets?" it echoed a famous quote of Stalin's, who said, "How many troops does the Pope have?" So they see that, Bibi Netanyahu's been enormously close to Republican Party leaders. He has Republican Party advisors. He appointed a Republican to be his ambassador just recently. And the Israelis have always done what they thought was best for them, and not really cared what American presidents or American Jews, particularly American Jews, felt. So I would say if American Jews feel that they want to, if they feel strongly about the direction that Israel is taking, their best effort would be to influence the policies of the American government. That's where they have some influence. The second thing I would say, not with the Israeli government, the second thing I would say is that American Jews ought to think about what it means to be an American Jew. I personally would say take a step back from defining oneself vicariously with Israel and ask yourself, Judaism's been around for a very long time. The Talmud was written, around, I think it was completed around 500 AD. So that's 1,800 years. Judaism's been around a long time without an Israel. And it survived all that time, and it will probably survive, indefinitely, but only if it renews itself in various times and places when it takes place. And that's the issue, actually, that animates me personally. I've told this story because it's been at the center of my experience as an American Jew and a historian of US foreign policy and a journalist who cares about liberalism and my country, and I care about Israel. But actually, telling this story has led me to the position that American Jews really need to find themselves in their own country rather than to find themselves vis-a-vis the lives of others.
I see a question from Doris Nichols, but we're just gonna hold on because I think it will be a nice way to close our conversation. So the next question is from Margaret Good Collins. How do you see the settlement policies of the US government versus the Israeli actions? How does the US Jewish community feel about the issue?
Well, I tell a story in the book where early in Barack Obama's presidency, he demanded that the Israelis freeze their settlement policy in order to bring the Palestinians back to the negotiating table. And he sent his deputy national security advisor, who's very well known. What's his last name, somebody? His first name is Ben, he writes books. Guy, do you know?
Yeah. Ben Sullivan?
No. That Jake Sullivan is the guy now. Laura, do you know? Ben who? Nobody can remember. No.
Rhodes.
Never mind.
Ben Rhodes.
Ben Rhodes. Okay. So he sent him to see this congressman to get his support to support the freeze on Israeli settlement building. And Ben came back to the president and he was all verklempt. And Barack said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I just saw this guy and he chewed me out over the settlement freeze." And Obama said, "Why? I thought he opposes the settlement." And he says, "He does, but more than that, he opposes doing anything about the settlement." And and I say that was the position of this congressman at the beginning of Obama's presidency, and it was the position of the Obama administration by the end of the Obama policy. So Israel, just the other day, this week, Israel had 14 illegal settlements according to its own laws. I mean, they're illegal, all illegal according to international law, but illegal according to Israel's laws. And in response to what Israel considered to be terrorist attacks on the Israelis, they legalized all of them to show the Palestinians, to be tougher on them. And the United States got upset about this because they were illegal according to Israel's law. And I think today Netanyahu said, "Okay, we'll wait on 5 of them and we'll only legalize 9 of them." So 9 Israeli settlements that were illegal according to Israel's own laws are now going to be legal. And the United States is not going to do it. Throughout history, Donald Trump was the first president to say, well, maybe they're not illegal. But US foreign policy has always said that these settlements are illegal. Donald Trump said maybe they're not. Biden has actually been a little closer to Trump than he has been to Trump's predecessors, because the US State Department recently refused to use the term, has stopped using the term occupied territory. It uses the same phrase that the Israelis prefer, which is disputed territory. So the short answer is that there will be some complaining. There will be some concessions whereby Israel only does part of what it wants to do, but there will be no serious sanctions. Israel will do what it wants to do anyway. The United States will take it and won't like it necessarily, but I don't see any. There's just, look, Barack Obama, like Jimmy Carter and like Bill Clinton, really wanted to bring peace to the Palestinians and Israelis. And they all had a pretty good idea of what that peace would look like. Carter was willing to pay a much higher price than Obama and Clinton were. But the fact is that that's not what an American president is elected to do. And it's incredibly costly with very little possibility of success. So there's just no percentage in fighting with the Israelis over things that the Israelis really care about. They're going to outweight you. They're ultimately not going to kowtow to you, and they're going to make you look weak. So you might as well just do your best to move on. And I think that's Biden's basic policy.
So, Eric, that prompts me to intervene here and say, well, it sounds like things are going in the direction of annexation and a one-state solution where the Israelis just take over all of the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, and they're stuck with a foreign population that almost equals the population of the Jewish portion of the population. So is that, well, then they'll have to deal with it, right? Then they'll have to deal with a one state and all those Palestinians. I think
now the Palestinians there's slightly more Palestinians between the river and the sea than there are Jews.
Including Gaza.
Yeah. Look, the problem with what you just said, my good friend Kai, is you said one state solution. It's not a solution.
Not a solution. I agree.
It's not even really a state, but it's a state of affairs. And yeah, I mean, the Israelis can live very comfortably with the way things are. And the Palestinians are powerless to prevent it, in part because their inability to speak with one voice and to deal pragmatically with the situation that they face. Look, if you take the moral arguments out of it, which is what you really ought to do when you talk about great power politics, the Israelis have won 14 or 15 wars, depending on how you count them. The Palestinians have won none. The Israelis don't feel like, the Palestinians make demands on the Israelis as if they won the wars, but they haven't won the wars. They're the weaker power. So they have to make compromises. But as I said earlier, those compromises are very difficult for them to make. So their diplomacy is incredibly ineffective. They're basically dependent on the United States to say, Israel, please be nicer to the Palestinians. And the United States, under Democrats, not under Trump, but under Democrats, is willing to say, okay, Israel, please be nicer. And Israel is going to respond, well, okay, we'll be a little nicer. And then
it's all hopeless, huh?
Well, I hate to say that, but if you say to me, like, you're supposed to, when you give talks on any topic, you're supposed to end optimistically, and I can't. So that's why I moved it to say, American Jews now have an opportunity to say, let the Israelis deal with Israel and the Palestinians deal with Palestine as best they can. Our voice is not really that valuable over there because they don't really care what we think. And anyway, we need to reimagine and rethink what it means for us to be American Jews, for us to be Jews of the future. And that's an opportunity. again, that's heretical in a lot of camps, but I feel good saying it, particularly because I'm sorry. I mean, this is one difference between myself and Peter Beinart, who has thrown himself into this fight in a way that I can't do it because I don't see any hope for victory. So I've chosen a different path, which is to say, what are we going to do about us? And like I said, the two largest Jewish communities in the world are in Israel and in the United States. Together, they make up 80% of the world's Jews. And this one has been living vicariously through that one for 50, 60 years. It's worked out all right, depending on how you defend it, but it doesn't work anymore. And it's just going to die off, except for the Orthodox, if we don't address that. So I'm here to say.
So when you say we are not one, you're really saying, if I understand you, you're saying that the diaspora is something to be valued and cherished in a way that it hasn't been in this debate for since the '67 war, maybe.
Yeah, that would be one way to put it. I mean, the diaspora is what has survived since the fall of, King David and King Solomon, etc. And Israel, historically speaking, is just a blip on that timeline. Now, that's not a value judgment. That's just a fact. So if the diaspora is going to tie itself to Israel, and the values of the Israelis are inconsistent with the values of the diaspora, well, that's not a formula for the longevity of the diaspora. And it is the exact policy of the organized Jewish or of organized Jewry to say to be a Jew means to support Israel, to fight anti-Semitism, and to remember the Holocaust. And that the religious part, we don't worry about that. There are a lot of people who work for Jewish organizations, quoted in this book, who say they don't care if you marry a non-Jew or you keep kosher or really anything. They care that you show up for Israel, period. And you can lose your job if you don't. And again, that actually did work. It did strengthen American Jewry in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when it was unclear, when Jews were feeling kind of lost and without purpose. But it ceased to work once it became clear that the values of the Israelis were not the values of American Jews. And that has become clearer and clearer. And by the way, in those polls that I talked about, where most American Jews are liberal and most Israelis are conservative, and most American Jews support Democrats and most Israeli Jews much prefer Trump. Well, the young people in those polls are much further in those directions than their parents and grandparents, so that young Israeli Jews are far more right-wing than their grandparents and parents, and young American Jews are far more liberal than their parents and grandparents. So the divide is only going to grow. And if you pretend it's not there, then the middle will fall out.
But so I understand it, most Israelis sort of look down on diaspora Jews and don't value that culture. And yet, ironically, you could argue that Zionism has succeeded in creating a new national identity that's not, quote, Jewish per se, as it is Israeli. And here, I
think that would have been true. I think that argument was made 20 years ago, but it's not true anymore. Israel has become much more Jewish than it was in the past. So that was kind of a hope of people like our friend Bernie Avishai, who wrote that book, The Hebrew Republic, where everybody could be equal under this Israeli flag. But I think Israel has transformed itself.
So you think that's all gone?
Yeah.
Into the trash bin.
I think there are two different forms of Judaism. Again, the Orthodox Jews in America, which are growing, I think I read somewhere that 40% of Jewish babies in New York are now Orthodox Jewish babies. So I don't actually do justice to that issue. But in terms of the historic American Jewish community, the secular American Jewish community that we're used to talking about, that is growing weaker and weaker, both in terms of the smaller number of Jews and the lack of interest among Israelis. who care what they think. They have no real reason to care because they're not powerful. And they're increasingly critical. So that's why I think the diaspora, the secular diaspora, needs to rethink its role.
We're going to wrap up soon this conversation. There was one final question from Doris Nichols, who's asking, how can we help you get more public exposure for your book in order to encourage debate in America?
Oh boy, thank you for that question. I wish I knew the answer. Feel free to write whatever newspaper you read and ask them, if they would take a look at my book. They don't have to agree with it. Like I said, I don't expect anyone to agree with all of it, but I am surprised and disappointed that this argument is not being dealt with, that it's proven so uncomfortable that aside from The Guardian and a few German publications, all of the attention that's been paid to it has been really on the Jewish side, both for and against. And it's not written only for Jews. I mean, I think it'd be of interest to Jews, certainly, given the role that Israel plays in American Jewish life and identity. But I think it's important for the future of American democracy, and also anyone interested in the history of the media. So I appreciate the question, and I'd be grateful for any help I can get.
So give the book as a gift to all your friends and use the discount code that Basic Books kindly produced for us, which is in the chat box. Are there any final questions? Kai, do you have any final question for Eric? Any of the attendees that are left in the room?
I think
Eric, you have some final words.
I think we've tried people's patience. We've been here for 90 minutes, and I appreciate the fact that people stuck around. And I'm sorry if some of my answers went on for a while, but like I said, everything is complicated.
Well, I want to thank you, Eric and Kai, for what has been, I think, a very nuanced discussion, and certainly very enlightening. The book is wonderful. Again, I highly recommend it. Read it, give it to your friends, and it will make you think. Thank you again for being here tonight. Thanks again, Eric and Kai, for this lively conversation.
Thank you, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.